Attention coaches, healers, practitioners, and seekers, if you want a system of integration and you want to apply it to any experience, I want you to come discover the Condor approach. It's a revolutionary method that's going to help transform every area of your life. So if you want to make breakthroughs last, and you don't want breakdowns to last so long in the psychedelic space and beyond, come check it out, because we're going to help you from preparation to navigation to integration and really break down what to track, what metrics matter in every body, because it's the most important step when it comes to growth. So come to the Condor Approach, condorapproach.com, and we will see you there, because you already know integration is not optional, but how you integrate is.
Whether you're a life coach, therapist, biohacker, invested in wellness, or in the healthcare profession, if you have an intention to work in psychedelic spaces, you're in the right place then. If you're called, get involved. But first, get informed. Let's talk the 4 N's: intake, intention, in-space integration, leading to deeper transformations. Psychedelic Coach Podcast, Todd Cole, walk you through the process. It's all possible. Leave space for the follow through. Most importantly, integration is not optional.
We're going to create some boundaries today.
Great.
That's a request.
Welcome.
Are you in for it?
Yes.
On the Psychedelic Coach
Podcast.
Okay. Well, y'all, I'm excited that you're here today, because I don't know about y'all, but it's kind of crazy out there in them Facebook, IG streets right now. And if you're feeling honestly like unheard, unseen, taken advantage of, if you're struggling to say no to things in your life, to posts on your feed, to friends you keep following, or find yourself consistently putting other people before you, today is a perfect episode for you. We're going to dive deep into the power of boundaries and requests and what the differences are, because I feel like they're pretty essential for communication. And if you want to have not just functional relationships, but healthy, I would say thriving, evolutionary, supportive ones, knowing boundaries and requests and the differences is kind of like critical.
It's beyond critical, and I don't think very many people know the difference between boundaries and requests.
Well, so then let's start there. Like, give me the overview of the difference between boundaries and requests.
Well, there's a very distinct difference between boundaries and requests when it comes to an energetic space, but when people lean into spaces, they don't really know the difference between the two. They can present in very similar ways. So to know the difference between boundaries and requests, one needs to know what a boundary is in the first place. And a boundary is something that indicates that there's a limit in place. There's a limit. And a boundary can also enforce or uphold that limit that's put into place. So if a person's touching me and I don't want them touching me, a boundary will enforce them not touching me. And so I will say, I can put my hand up, I can gesture, I can say, don't touch me. But if the person decides to move beyond it, it's not enforced, right? So that's not a boundary. So if a person is in a position where they're stating, don't touch me, or I don't want to be touched, that's a request. So a request is something that indicates that there's a limit and you want it to be honored, but you may not have an enforcement of that request, right? So it's like an ask or a plea for honoring that limit. Could you please not touch me? Is not a boundary. That's a request. And there are many people... Versus,
if you touch me, I'm going to remove myself or punch you in the face because I have a boundary if you touch me.
Or I'm going to move your hand off of me. That's a boundary.
Oh, no, I'm going to punch you in the face. Okay. Not you, but you know, the you out there.
You understood, right? It's the you understood. We learned that in English class. You understood. It's just,
yeah, I didn't actually know.
I'm talking to you.
You said you understood. I did not understand the understood from your English class because I did not take this class.
Well, one of the confusing things for people is they will command, don't touch me, don't touch me. And that's still a request. You can command, you can demand all you want. But if there's not an enforcement in place, then a person can move beyond your request. And so a request is like boundary light, right? And so there's a distinction between having a boundary and having a request. I can say it's like if I have a kid in my house that like I'm raising a kid, and I say, hey, don't touch the cookie jar. And the kid goes over and goes in the cookie jar. And I say, hey, I said don't touch the cookie jar.
That was a request.
That's a request. That's not a boundary. Now, if the kid keeps going and touching the cookie jar, I can pick up the cookie jar and move it, or I can stand in front of the cookie jar and say, you're not going to touch this cookie jar.
And then you could put it on the top shelf.
And then you move it.
Or whatever.
Right. But you still, the boundary has to be enforced. And so it's and there's also a very distinct consequence to if you touch the cookies, this is going to happen. There has to be an enforcement. It doesn't have to be, but the more you have clear directives of what the consequence will be, the stronger your boundary is.
And I want to preface too. So when we say consequence, we're actually referring to like cone sequence, like with sequence. When A happens, B happens.
Right.
When you do cause, there is this effect. Not that consequence is punishment. It is the sequence after you make this decision.
Right. There's a sequence. It's like, okay, listen, if you keep, like my brother would put this is why when you put your hand on my face, like close to my face, I move back. My brother used to take the heel of his hand and he used to put it up against my forehead and be like, what you going to do about it? And I would walk around and he would walk around the house with his hand pushed against my forehead. And it would drive me nuts. And I'd say, stop touching me. That's a request.
Yeah.
And then one day he got punched in the face. Right? He did get punched in the face. And that's when this type of menacing stopped. I was 14. I was 13 or 14 when that happened.
This is where I think people get a little bit stuck in relationships, is because they aren't clearly, like, their boundaries are being crossed all the time. We hear that a lot from people that come to our trainings. It's like, I set boundaries, people don't honor the boundaries. And so this is I think a good example, and it reminds me when I was first coming to stay at your house before it was my house, that there were boundaries, but there were unspoken boundaries, and there was never really any requests per se, but kind of. So like before I came to stay at your house, you just didn't let people in.
That was my boundary. I didn't want people in my stuff.
Like you had no roommates,
nope,
6-bedroom house.
I had a big house with nobody in it but me. And I was great with that.
And one really uncomfortable red couch.
That was my brother's couch. But anyway, I didn't want anybody in the house with me because I had been with people in the house. They didn't clean up after themselves, or they left a mess, and I had to clean things up. And it was just, I didn't want anybody in the house with me. And so when I invited you to come stay with me, that wasn't even when I asked you to come live with me.
No, that was like when I would just come. Bro, the first like 2 times I came to your house, I made it 2 steps into the house before it felt like an energetic iron curtain. Like literally it felt like I walked into your house and there was one of those thick velvet curtains from theater, like that you walked into it and it was like you put, just like your brother put that hand up on your forehead, you like energetically, that's how I felt walking into your house.
Well, as a kid, there was a lot of my stuff was broken on purpose. Stuff was taken away and not returned. Stuff was thrown out. Like my stuff was violated. And I'm not coming from a victim space. I'm saying this, my stuff was destroyed. It was taken away. And so there was a long period of my life where I just didn't buy stuff for myself because I just didn't think that it was going to last, so I'd have it. And the things that I had, I kept to myself. And so when I had an opportunity to live by myself, I was just like, that's it. That's it. Don't touch my stuff. Don't go on my phone. Don't do this. This is the area you can rest your stuff.
Here is the 2x2 square that you may set your person. And if you need to use the bathroom, you're going to have to take that 2x2 square with you. Don't touch anything. Don't breathe too loudly.
And this is one of the things, y'all. Boundaries can come from trauma. right? We will create boundaries, and these will be unspoken boundaries, right? Like, these are the boundaries I have. Don't be touching my stuff. Don't come in my house and touch my stuff.
You never said anything like that.
No, but that's what I was feeling. I was like, don't.
Oh, no, that's
house.
what I felt.
Don't come in my house and touch my stuff. Don't go through my shit. Don't go in my closet.
Do you remember when when I did finally like move in? And I said to you, I was like, I just don't really feel like I see myself here. And you're like, baby, move in. It's all good. This dude had pictures propped up against the wall because he wouldn't put nail holes in it. Okay.
Those weren't my pictures.
Bro, no, you did have your pictures in there. You had some of your records and things people had made before. And it was like sitting on the stack of CDs, leaning against the wall, son. Like... So when I was there,
Laugh at my traumas. It's okay. It's all right.
I am now because you've processed them.
It's all good. Laugh at them. I'm not mad.
And so I had gone to, that hall closet up by the bathroom on the top floor.
Yep. I remember very clearly.
I thought I was doing something very considerate and nice to organize this closet of towels and like alcohol pads and the things you use to like shave your head. And y'all, when I tell you, when you got home, it was like full trauma response meltdown. Like it was quite serious.
I didn't have a meltdown.
Kind of.
I didn't say anything.
You did. Because that was one of the first times I saw you kind of lose it, and I was all, this has nothing to do with the closet.
I remember the first thing I did, I didn't say anything at first. Mm-hmm. And then I was like, did you move it? And then I know I asked, did you move the stuff in my closet?
Yeah. And then it was meltdown. And it's perfect because anyway.
I'd like to hear about this meltdown. I want to hear about the meltdown. Tell me about the meltdown.
We'll talk about the meltdown after the podcast. No, because there's specific details I would actually want to talk to you about first, because it was actually quite an interesting situation. So that was a prime example of unspoken boundaries and unspoken requests. Like, because it's almost like because I didn't know what I could or couldn't do. I mean, on one hand, I felt like I could, but then unconsciously, or because of past circumstances, there was like other energetic, like you were talking about the different types of boundaries. It's not just like physical boundaries. There's like emotional boundaries and energetic boundaries.
Well, there's spoken boundaries, there's physical boundaries that are touch, based. There's gestures, there's ideas, things that we think about, and this was an ideological boundary that I had. I had this boundary of don't touch my stuff. Nobody should come in here and touch my stuff, and it was an ideological space, and it was unspoken. So we have spoken and we have unspoken boundaries, and this was an unspoken boundary that I did not share with you. And so it wasn't our boundary space, it was my boundary space. And so there's no way that you could know about it because I didn't tell you about it. And this is one of the things that we've seen a lot of people have challenges with, is one person will have a boundary.
They should know.
And they don't share it. And they suppose that everybody else is supposed to know.
No.
Oh, it's common knowledge. And this is where this idea of common
there
sense
is no common
hogwash.
Yeah.
It's absolute hogwash from my vantage point. You should know better. This is a thing that a lot of women get trapped up, and I'm not saying this to blanket statement women. A lot of women that we've worked with have this thing with the man should just know. He should just know. Mm-hmm. That's an unspoken boundary or an unspoken dynamic or an unspoken rule that is just in the ether.
Well, and then I
That's an ideological space.
Yeah, and then I came in and I almost then provided boundaries for myself with regard to you, where it was like, if I saw, and even still, not still, but I still observe, like, if your phone was sitting on the counter and like it lit up, I'd have to avert my eyes because I had my own rules or boundaries around going through someone's stuff. And even though it's right there and it's not like I'm trying to, I noticed I came in with my self-imposed boundaries. So it's like, say your journal's on the counter, say someone comes to the door, like I shouldn't look. I shouldn't, you know what I mean? So it's almost like then I created my own little boundaries, which also affects like the authenticity of the connection. If I'm trying to not step on the boundaries I don't know.
Well, I mean, so then this is what we talk about at the Condor approach all the time. We talk about constructs.
Yeah.
And constructs have these ideological structures in place that you're just supposed to understand, these rules. And so when we have institutional boundaries, these are rules, right? And these are institutions, like a family is an institution, a business is an institution, a marriage is an institution, and they have rules set up. They have foundational tenets that are set up. And if we, and this is why we get married every year, right? Every year we decide if we're going to have this relationship again, and we set up a whole new rule structure.
It's like a whole new terms of engagement for the relationship.
Right.
Because we're evolving beings. And to me, it's actually shocking how many people are not in a continual dialogue around the construct of their relationships.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, and this is the way the world has been working. So people are always like, I don't understand how y'all do it. We change it up. We are constantly changing. We're evolving as individuals, so the relationship has to evolve. And so our boundaries around the relationship change. Our boundaries around our sexuality has changed. Our boundaries around how we interact with one another, the people we
Our money.
with, our money situations, all these things change. And it's like, okay, when we first got together, it was separate everything and all this, and we put our money together. Like, there are all these different boundaries that we create together. And there are many people who have solo boundaries on each side, and they don't discuss them, so they don't overlap. And this is where people have challenges in their relationships, because they have these unspoken boundaries, or they have requests that they haven't made into boundaries.
Right. And I think that's what you just said there around like the boundaries is how can you actually be consensual if you haven't even put it out on the table? You're not consenting. So that's where resentment and frustration and hurt and everything comes to the surface, is the unspoken. And then people say they don't respect me and my boundaries. And then they tell us this is what they're doing. We're like, well, did you tell them? Well, yeah. No, did you actually say that those words to this person?
They'll say, no, they know.
They know. Well, or they'll say, well, yeah, I mean, I told them. I'm like, no, like specifically, well, I mean, they should know that the XYZ.
Based off of the context and the derivatives of the covalent bonding process with ionization.
Divided by pi.
Get out of here. Like, but this, and I'm not here saying that I'm devoid of this in the past. I have been part of this type of dynamic.
Well, I feel like it's a constant practice of uncovering, because so much is in the shadow that until it's like you have to increase your capacity for authenticity and honesty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so people don't create boundaries from a very active space. When people are, like, I'm in a men's group, right? And we have all these dudes that come together, and we call it a brotherhood and all of this stuff. But then people will automatically say, that's my friend. And I'll be like, okay, if you're going to call me your friend, what does that mean? Because I have very, very clear definitions of what a friend is for me. What does that mean to you? And what are the lines that we can lean into? What are the lines you'll cross? You know what I mean? What does that look like? You know? And we talk about it, and we dive into it, and we create around that. But most people don't do that with friendships. Mm-hmm. They don't do it with marriages. Even jobs. They don't do it with jobs. Like, I need to have boundaries with, if I'm working for you, I need to know what the job's boundaries are. So there's something in nursing. Like, I've been a nurse for a long time, and there's something called scope of practice. And if you go beyond the scope of practice, that's where lawsuits happen. Or if you underperform below your scope of practice, that's where lawsuits come from, right? You have malpractice. So would those be business or like structure boundaries? They're institutional rules. Okay, so institutional boundaries? Yeah, they're boundaries, right? Rules are boundaries. Yeah. Right? Rules are boundaries that are created. That are created. Now, the rules can come in two ways. They can come in a boundary form, and they can come in a request form. Don't cross this line, right? And it's like, don't cross the yellow line in the subway, right? There's this yellow line. If you cross that line, you know, what's going to happen? You're going to get hit by a train, or maybe the cops will see you, maybe you'll get a fine, maybe something will happen. You know, I don't know. But if it's not enforced, it is a rule that is a request, not necessarily a boundary. So in regard, or to bring back in the example of when I first started coming to your house, what would be an example of that? of an unspoken rule?
Of like a request or this is the line, don't cross it. Because we were in dialogue. Now, when we first got together, we were going to psychedelic journeys. So we would just talk all of this through. So we didn't necessarily have a structure initially. But I guess the ceremony was the environment that created structure for us to have these conversations.
Yeah, it was. And we talked about this stuff in
ceremony, yeah.
In psychedelic experiences, and which was an awesome place for us to really create solid boundaries and a safe space where we got to put it into a physiological dynamic in our bodies because we were in a neuroplastic space.
And a what happens when plan, not for if wounds come to the surface, but when they do. Like we were talking about things when it was easy and in the newness and simple, and being what happens when, where it was like, well, what happened in the past? What did you do? What has come up for you in the past? How can I support you? So we started to have like these terms of engagement without knowing what it was called or what we were really doing, aside from we wanted to enjoy each other.
Right. So the thing that came up when you asked just now, the whole thing with the closet was I said, hey, if you're going to move after I got it out of my system, I said, hey, listen, if you're going to move my stuff again, I need you to say something to me. Otherwise, this is not going to work out.
Yeah, it was shocking to your nervous system.
Yeah, it was my whole.
It was an
body
act of violence, really, for your nervous system.
Yeah, I mean, you went through my stuff, you moved my stuff around, and I appreciated it, and I got to the point of being in gratitude for it, and it helped out a lot, and it was hands moving through my stuff, and I had often been punished for the things that I had in my house by the women I was with, or I had a lot of physically abusive situations with women in my life, and
you're also a momentum keeper, so I could see how if a woman is looking for like evidence of something, like you keep letters and
mementos.
Yeah, you're a mementos kind of person.
Yeah, I do have mementos, and I've had some of my mementos burned, thrown in the garbage, torn, broken, all of this stuff by jealous.
It's adorable how much you love the things that you love. If it means something to you, it's precious.
I don't have very many things that I hold on to, but the things that I hold on to, I really
now. But I would say in the house you had a lot of things, because there was a lot that we went through when we moved.
There's still some stuff. Anyway, the boundary was, hey, listen, if you're going to do this, I need you to come and tell me something. Otherwise, this relationship is not going to work out, and you're going to have to go. And that was a scary place for me to enforce, because I really was I'm still into you. I was really into you.
Well, and it didn't feel like an ultimatum. It felt like that's where you were. And I think this is where boundaries, people can maybe at times make ultimatums versus communicating the boundary and the result.
Well, yeah, an ultimatum is a form of consequence in a boundary space.
But I feel like people use it as a threat. I think that's what I'm referring to. Like a threat for compliance versus communicating because I'm looking to feel safe within this structure.
Yeah, I mean, if a person is threatening something for compliance, then the person not complying is the safe space for
Totally.
them. So it's always, an ultimatum is always when somebody doesn't feel safe about something. Or they want to have control over something they feel they don't have control over. But an ultimatum is a form of boundary. It's a very harsh boundary. It can be used by people who gaslight and stuff like that, who are in very frightful spaces that a person's going to leave, and they need to have control over the situation.
So how would you define an energetic boundary? Say you were talking to someone that was new to boundary creation. How would you kind of contrast the physical or the touch aspect of boundaries with like energetic? Yeah,
if a person walks into your field and you start to feel a certain way, there's a proximity situation, right? And so if there's an energetic boundary, if a person, this is why when we do our intake forms, when we're doing experiences, and this is something we teach at Condor as well, is, what's your situation with proximity, and how do you feel about that? Because if a person, and how a person looks at you, a person can look at you and there's an energetic shift. when somebody's looking at you, their energy is focused on you. So it's like, don't look at me. Don't look at me. Don't leer at me. Don't wave at me. Like, all of these things are energetic spaces.
So kind of like if we had, say, ex-military people that didn't do well with really intense eye contact because maybe different reasons of diagnosis or PTSD, the eye contact was too much, or like with, say, women that were devoted to Islam, then having them too close energetically to a male-bodied person would make it hard for them to feel safe because they're not used to being in such close proximity to someone that's not their husband.
Yeah.
Would those be like energetic?
That can spill over into an energetic space, an energetic and institutional space at the same time. But energy moves through everything, and so energy can move through a spoken boundary, it can move through a physical touch boundary, it can move through gestures, it can move through all of these different things. So understanding that there is an energetic consequence when a person looks at you, there's an energetic exchange. When a person is proximal to you physically, there's an energetic exchange. And so do we have energy boundaries? Some people are like, I don't want people within 10 feet of me. So how many times have you heard that? And it's with your human design. When you get into a big energy space, you need like 11 feet. Right? 12 feet. There you go. So you need like 11 or 12 feet. So I have to move away. There's an energetic boundary. And so that can be a space where it's like, listen, if you see me get into this place, I need you to step back 12 feet. Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to talk to you, right? And so, or I'm going to remove myself from the space. That's an energetic boundary.
So then if that's boundaries, then let's re-articulate now requests.
Okay. Yeah, requests are easy. Requests are a plea for a limit. Whenever we talk about boundaries are limiters, and they always involve the word no to some degree. No, yes, right? And so like no and yes are in the middle, in the zero space, and then you have the negatives going down to the no, all to the full-on no, and the positive going on to the full-on yes, right? And so there, smack dab in the middle is where yes and no connect. And when you have a boundary, there's always a no involved. No. The request is a request for a person to not do something. It's a request for a no. I don't want you to touch this. So
if I was going to request a boundary,
request a limit.
Oh, but this is where I want to take this, and this is where I want to clarify this, because I think a lot of people are requesting boundaries versus understanding they're requesting limits. So if I tell you, please don't eat, if there's only 2 eggs left in the fridge, please don't eat them. I want to have those for breakfast tomorrow, as a request, versus if I say, look, I have 2 eggs left. I'm asking that you don't eat them. And if you do, I'm going to ask you to leave. So how can you help someone that might be listening right now who thinks they are requesting boundaries to clearly understand they're requesting limitations, and boundaries are more of a rule? So
a request is like boundary light. They're both about limits.
Boundary-ish.
Yeah, boundary-ish. It's all about limits. There are specific limits that you have, and in order for the limit to be carried out, it needs to be enforced. A boundary enforces the limit. A request is a plea for the limit. Please, could you please not eat my eggs? Hey, don't eat my eggs. Don't eat my eggs. It's even a command or a demand. Don't eat my eggs. But if there's no enforcement, then a person will walk right through that request and do it.
If they feel like it,
because a request is a very loose boundary, or it's on the looser side of a boundary. Right?
Do you think that's why a lot of times in relationships, people are making requests that they're calling boundaries, but they're saying, look, please don't do this. And then someone does it and they go, see, they don't honor, or, so it almost makes them like not feel respected or not feel appreciated or valued, because they feel like people are never honoring their quote unquote boundaries.
Yeah, well, This is because there's never been a distinction for people. And this is why we're here having this podcast. This is why we're doing the work that we do, is so that people can understand the distinction between a request and an actual boundary.
And the necessary vocalization and clarification of the boundaries.
And the energetic space of being in your boundary. You can say, hey man, listen, if you do that, I'm going to punch you in the face. And a person might try to walk through that because they don't feel it. This is why clear and emphatic is very important, and understanding how to be emphatic with your no's. This is an emphatic no. This is an emphatic yes. I mean it. Don't touch my stuff, or this is going to happen. Don't touch my stuff, or I'm leaving. Don't touch my stuff because this may be the result.
So a lot of people have those that they don't communicate and then shut down and walk away. I used to have an unspoken boundary that if someone, say, called me the B word, or there were certain triggers that if you did that, I'm out. And it was a zero tolerance boundary. But it's not like I actually told anyone about those boundaries. So say more about that.
That's a one-sided boundary. So communication happens with one or more. It happens with itself, and then when it's between one or more people, a person has to communicate with the other person or people in order for that to be in a mutual context space. And we talk about mutuality of context at the Condor approach all the time. Mutual meaning both parties or all of the parties are in a space where they get it. They understand it. They understand it. They get the context, and it makes sense on both sides, and we're all clear on it. That's mutuality of context. Okay. When I'm a person and I have a boundary for myself on something, I can honor my own boundary with me. But if the other person doesn't know the boundary, they may walk right through it because they have no idea.
So that's like when I draw a boundary that's not communicated versus when we got into this marriage and relationship, we co-created boundaries so that we understood, like, here's the door, here's the window, here is the structure and the walls and the ceiling and the floor. Those are all, architectural boundaries we created in our relationship. Mm-hmm. So do you think this is where a good chunk of disagreements in relationships come from?
I think that it's most relationship disagreements come from this. The thing with people with these boundary spaces, the violation comes when a person, like, you may live in a household where your parents had zero boundaries. Everything was requests, and you'd watch both parents walk all over each other. So you learn that there's no honoring anybody's request. You do whatever it is that you want. And then you get into a relationship with me. I'm in a household where everything is a boundary. Right? Everything is a boundary. You can't have this. So
you can only use those glasses, or those drawers are open to you. That's my office. Don't go in there, or whatever.
Right. So anytime if my household is very strict, anytime a request was made, that request was automatically assumed to be a boundary. And if you violated it, maybe you got beat or you got punished or something like that. So I come from a very strict household. If you come from a very loosey-goosey household where there are no spoken boundaries, there are no enforced boundaries, and I say to you, hey, don't go through my stuff, and you go through my stuff, I may automatically, from my family constructs and the upbringing that I have, assume that you are going to honor the boundaries that I have because
in the ways you do them.
Because requests in my space are actual boundaries. And so this is why we need to have mutuality of context. We need to discuss these things. We need to talk about boundaries. Listen, what are your boundaries? And what are the consequences if I move beyond it? And this is like, people talk about cheating. Well, he's cheating on me. Well, did y'all discuss what cheating is? Well, no, everybody knows what cheating is. No, did you discuss what cheating is? Well, no. Okay, so have you had a conversation with this person, and maybe their parents were polyamorous? How do you know? You don't know. And so this is where having the conversation and getting super clear and crystal clear and granular is extremely important when having these conversations.
Yeah, and I think that the unspoken part, like, even aside from like the cheating conversation, it's like, if there's one left, please don't eat it if it's something I really like, because it actually is hurtful in a deeper way than just the item, right? And when you start to be able to articulate to someone, Actually, when it's the last one, it reminds me about when I was little, when I saved all my money up to buy this one treat for myself that I would save so it would last. And then someone would come and take it. And when you start to understand, like you said, that context differently, then you don't brush off someone's boundaries as being stupid. Because that's another thing I watch people do, is they think that a boundary request is silly or, oh, come on, you're being too serious, which only further causes problems. You know, I have a specific conversation I had with someone in particular around their parent, where they tried to draw a boundary with their parent, and their parent would just kind of laugh and tell them to not be so serious and poke at them more. And so we talked about, in boundary creation, it's not just saying, if you do that again, I'm leaving. It's being able to explain and articulate the importance of being heard if you believe the other person really cares about you. I don't believe most people do it out of malice. It's that they don't understand why something's important to you. So it seems silly.
It's a value dynamic.
Yeah.
And when you look at any kind of conflict, and this is one of the things that whole conflict dynamics thing that I was showing you that came through that a couple of months ago, conflict dynamics are based off of value. If you don't value my boundary, if you don't know the depth of how important something is to me, you may walk in and walk all over my boundary spaces. And it's up to me to enforce my boundary. And if I'm taught how to not take care of myself, and if I learn to fawn and people please, this is where I let other people walk all over the boundaries that I have within myself that are unspoken, that I haven't spoken about, or maybe I have spoken about, and I don't want to let somebody down or whatever. I may fawn, and I may let people walk all through my boundaries. This happens a lot with people with sexual relationships, where people will be like, I just wanted to please him, and I let that happen, or I didn't want her to be mad, so I did this, right? And so you have all of these fawning dynamics where people are doing sexual things because they want to please the other person, but they didn't express their boundaries up front, so the other person didn't know.
Or they don't take any action towards pursuing their partner because they're afraid of crossing any boundaries because they haven't been clearly defined. And then the other, the person who's not being pursued or not, maybe getting connection that they might want, they didn't define how would someone know where your boundaries were. So the safest thing is to do nothing or to retreat, which isn't really that helpful in a relationship if there can't be confrontation without conflict. So let me ask you then, if someone is making a request, how would they approach it versus a boundary? Like, let's say someone's in a new relationship, less than a year, it's pretty new. How would you go about establishing some of the requests and boundaries in a new relationship again, knowing what you know now? Because we've grown together for 11 years, so what would you do now?
Well, firstly, it's no.
Even though you're never leaving me. I love you. My precious.
Help me. Help me. I'm falling. So the first thing, and I worked on this with a client the other day. The first thing is, do you know what your boundaries are? Do you know what you want your boundaries to be? What are your deal breakers? What is the ultimate space where, like, I'm out of here, right? And then you work backwards. Yep. I'm out of here. This will be a 3-strike zone. On the 3rd strike, I'm out of here, right? This is where it's like, okay, I can mess with that, but just I'm gonna push you away, or I'll set limits in real time or whatever. And then you get the person to establish what they would like their boundaries to be, and then they bring that to the conversation, and they're like, hey, I'd like to make a request for us to discuss these boundaries, right? I want to make a request. And these are things that are not going to be a request space. These are boundary spaces where there's an actual consequence, where it's like, I'd like you to touch my hair, or I'd like you to do this, or I'd like to feel,
That'd be nice.
Those are requests, right? And so those are requests to have things done. And then it's like, when it gets to this much, or if I say green, that's a limit space, I'd like you to stop. That's a request. But it's like, if I make a request and you don't stop, then I'm going to leave or I'm going to push you off me, that's a boundary.
Or it's going to make it really hard for me to, like, we had this at the beginning of our relationship where the volume, when we would get in arguments or anything, not arguments, when we would get in conversations, I'd get loud. If there was any emotional component to it, I would get loud. And so initially you had a request of like, don't get loud. But then that just triggered me more. Because it was like, don't get loud. But my past was that I was too much for people, too loud, too this, too that. And so then when we had dialogue around creating boundaries, we had conversations, something along the lines of, look, your anger is welcome here. But when you talk at that volume, and you point it at me, it makes it difficult for me to hear you. And I want to hear you. So what can we do to welcome your anger without it being projected at me? And that was a huge game-changing conversation for me with us. And it's not like I nailed it. I think it took me a solid 7 years.
8, maybe 10. No, no, we've never had an argument.
No, not yeah. No, I'm not talking about an art. I just mean emotional charge.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was a wonderful conversation for me to be able to actually say what I needed, and for it to be honored, and for me to hold that boundary up. It's like, listen, I will not be spoken to in this fashion, and if I'm spoken to in this fashion, I'm not going to respond. I'm going to move away from it. That was honored, and I appreciate it.
And you said it makes me feel like I want to run.
Yeah, it makes me feel like I want to run. It makes me feel, there's fear that comes through my body, and that has nothing to do with you. I want your anger to be welcome here. It is welcome here, and I want to be able to process that. So what I do, when I'm like, hey, listen, if this is going to be the volume, I'm going to need to step back, because my energetic proximity, I have a boundary on that. So I'll keep my boundary, and I'll say, hey, I'm going to step back. You can keep speaking, but I'm going to step back, because if I stay here, I'm not going to be able to hear you. So I know my boundaries with that, and I can keep my boundary in that space. And I ask you, are you cool with my boundary? And when you say yes, that lets us settle into a physiological space where we both honor the boundary. Mm-hmm.
And I can't stress this enough, that what made such a difference is that we talked about it when things were easy. And I feel like people become a bit complacent when things are easy, and then wonder why they can't process things when it's hard, when life is happening, when it's challenging. Because even in, I would say, our most challenging lifing moments with clients, with friends, with family, I still never perceived that our communication ever broke down. It might have been more challenging for me at times to hear or to be able to articulate, but at the same time, there still was no question that you were totally on my team and I wanted to be here. And I think a lot of that has to do with all of the intentional creation we put when things were easy, of how do we create boundaries that keep us safe, that keep the relationship fortified, like any vehicle. Check engine light comes on, what's going on? Long before, because we joke around that when we first started seeing each other, we're going to ride it till the wheels fall off. But then we kept going and having checkups on the vehicle. Check engine light on, cool, we just check it out. So it was never some big detrimental blow up issue, problem, we'll say. And I attribute a lot of that to all the conversations we had, and assuming no boundaries assuming as if we know nothing.
I never assume that we know nothing. I'm always looking for us to create something together and create from that knowledge space.
Well, I just mean not assuming that not to assume that you think the way that I do.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, I mean, that's something that I don't do. I don't assume you're thinking the way I'm thinking, and that was a very lonely space for me growing up. Was I didn't assume that other people knew what I knew. I always asked questions, and I got told I asked too many questions, and so I shut down around a lot of things and just stopped asking questions and just leaned into being in a space by myself. And that was a boundary that I set up with myself, and I didn't let people in, and I closed myself off. Boundaries are like saloon doors. When you think about the old Westerns, right? We have two directions with our boundaries. We have incoming boundaries. We have outgoing boundaries. And so when we're talking about sharing information, I may have very loose outgoing boundaries with how I share my information and very tight with the incoming. I may not let information in. And so there are people who will constantly talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. And when somebody else says something, they don't hear it. They don't let information in. And then there are people who listen, and then they don't give any feedback. They won't let any information out. And so it's the same thing with touch. Some people will allow themselves to be touched and touched and touched and touched, and they won't touch anybody else. And then there are people who are always touching, and they won't allow themselves to be touched. And so there's these different dynamics in boundaries, and understanding where your touch boundaries are, where your energetic boundaries are, where your relational boundaries are, with your financial boundaries. It's like, listen, how much money are you going to spend before you say no?
Well, I remember when we had conversations around financial boundaries where we said, look, if it's under $100, don't worry about it. Anything over that, let's have a conversation. And that was such an easy way to, as a simple boundary, because I think that even with finances, people don't communicate it, and then they feel taken advantage of or restricted or whatever, versus coming to mutual context and understanding, creating the boundaries together.
Right. Well, that's a request, right? If it's more than $100, then let's talk about it. Because if we don't talk about it and the money's gone, I'm not going to feel safe and I'm not going to stay here. That's the consequence of the situation. This is where the boundary comes into play. It's like, what is the definition of the consequence? Do you have a defined consequence? That's the difference. It's the defined consequence. I can request all that I want. Hey, listen, if it's over $100, I need you to come tell me, and you don't do it. And you keep doing it, and then I just leave. And you're like, why did you leave? Right? Because I didn't set a very clear boundary. It was a boundary within myself, but I didn't share it with you, one-sided. And so this is where I feel like there's a lot of challenge around relationships with individuals, in marriages, in romantic relationships, in friendships, in parent-child, sibling relationships, in corporations and in countries.
Totally.
Like, we do not have very clear boundaries with each other, and then we step all over it. And then we make bombs and we bomb people, right? We do all this. And it happens in households, it happens in countries, it happens in churches, it happens in all these places. And one of the benefits, the biggest benefits of the Condor approach is we teach people how to create effective boundaries and to communicate and create mutuality of context.
Oh, which reminds me, you're going to do a whole workshop on this.
Right.
So I'll give more details, but in case anyone's listening and they're like, this is a lot to unpack. What do you mean? The types of boundaries, the touch, the spoken, the unspoken, the ideological and energetic and relationships, and you're going to be doing an epic workshop on helping people not only to understand boundaries, like really, but workshop them through creating boundaries, communicating boundaries, so that they can honestly put them in place effectively.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to be awesome. It's going to be, there'll be like a 30-minute class at the front end where I'm going to talk about boundaries, what they are, the different types.
Like the characteristics and stuff.
Right. And then we're going to go through it, and we're going to list out all the places that you want to have boundaries, and then we're going to actively create those boundaries. And then if you have questions, any fears around enforcing those boundaries, or what your plan or your strategy is, we're going to create strategies around that on that call. It's going to be a 3-hour class. It's going to be awesome.
Yeah. I mean, the difference of learning about boundaries and then walking through the process of identifying, creating, and implementing. You said bring all your boundaries. You'll probably get through a couple in the workshop, but this year actually going to teach a system for how to identify where you don't have boundaries, where you want them, how to create them, implement them, and then you have to analyze them and see how it goes. Just because you go into your household and say, I have a new boundary. It reminds me of that episode of The Office when he says, I declare bankruptcy. It's kind of like that. Like, I declare boundary. Here it is. You shall not pass.
Yeah, well, this is part of the construct space. When you have a family construct, you have a relationship constructs that have very loose boundaries or extremely tight boundaries, and then you come in with new boundaries, you may have challenges integrating that. That's what the Condor approach is about. It's about integrating the newness. And there are many people that have gone for psychedelic experiences and they come back realizing that they had loose or no boundaries, or their boundaries were too tight. And so they go home and it's like, hey, honey, I want to hug now. And the partner's like, hug who? You don't hug anybody. What are you talking about? The boundary dynamics have changed. And so to be able to have the discussion, to have the active discussion around boundaries is important. And I feel like this is one of the things that goes way under the radar with psychedelics is boundaries. Boundaries with the facilitators, with the shamans, with the curanderos, like all of the people that are working in psychedelic spaces. Have you set clear boundaries with them? Have they established boundaries with you? This is where all of the drama comes from with sexual touch and all of these different things.
Well, people come in with either really loose boundaries or really tight, harsh boundaries. And understandably so in both directions. Some people come in wanting to trust the facilitator or guide because they haven't trusted people, but too loosey-goosey lets too much in, and too tight doesn't let anything in. So it's, if you don't define it, then the likelihood you're going to get the outcome you desire is not so likely. You know, like for me as a general rule, I do not like to be touched in ceremony at all unless I request it. And that comes from my own experience of having people touch me in ways that I didn't want. And so it compensated with putting up like a drawbridge just like completely shut off, that unless I request it in that vulnerable place, because for me it feels vulnerable, it makes me feel super guarded. And it's something that I've worked a lot with, but it's something that I had to learn too, to one, not go in too tight, but on the other side, being able to communicate where my boundaries are in a way for facilitators, guides, teachers, coaches. I've had to draw boundaries with coaches who started to project their ideas on me. Or coaches or even colleagues in the space who came in and said, this is the only way you can talk to me. I said, well, you just drew a boundary that you never communicated to me. This doesn't work for me. It was enacted. It was put harshly into place. So it was repelling. Yeah. So it's knowing that there is a way to build a construct or a boundary that is, I would say, educating your environment, or so you can get consent.
Listen, I mean, I have a perfect example of a boundary crossing with one of my clients. Like, I'm not even in the psychedelic spaces. This is one of my one-on-one coaching clients. I do a quarterly check-in form with my clients, and one of my clients, I said, one of the questions is, if there's anything that you could change or there's a challenge with me, what is that? And they were like, well, there's this very clear boundary in the contract of how often I can have correspondence during the week, and you have repeatedly offered more time than that, because the person was going through a process. And I was like, look, if you need me, hit me up. You know, if you need to go beyond 5 minutes, hit me up. It doesn't make a difference. And they were like, I have boundary issues already, and this is making me feel unsafe because I'm walking into your boundary space. And so I've had my boundaries crossed, and I've fawned and all this other stuff. And so I didn't realize it was a blind spot for me as a coach. And so this is a very, very important space, is to be able to discuss the malleability of your boundaries. And I did not discuss the malleability of the boundaries with that. Now, this was like, you know, our conversations on the Marco Polo app and, you know, and that. And they never overstepped it, but they didn't feel safe with me going beyond,
because they didn't know where the boundary was anymore. Well,
they also a very corporate person. They work in a very corporate environment, so contracts are very important. And so since they've had things violated in their life period, for them to have me say this very clearly in the contract, you are restricted to 4 minutes a day at this time and blah, 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 for me to be like, nah, just call me. Just hit me up. They will, you know, it shook things up for them. And
I mean, that can sound hard to trust from something so restrictive to something so open.
Yeah.
Versus saying like, hey, I put that in the contract, but I acknowledge you're going through a lot right now, and I've got space right now. So just know that, you know, for this next few weeks, know that you can reach out to me and that I don't have a limiter on it right now.
And asking them if that's okay.
Totally.
Right? So this is where the mutuality comes into place. I opened the boundary up without asking consent from the other side, and we had a contract together. So I agreed to the contract. They agreed to the contract. I stepped outside of it by extending myself, and I did not ask for permission to move outside of the contract space. So I moved beyond the boundary that we both agreed upon.
And if they're working on boundaries, you're modeling behavior that is counterproductive for them.
That's right. And so, again, this is one of the things that I appreciate about us at Condor and us and just what we do together, me and you, is that when we fall short, we acknowledge it and we move beyond it and we learn to grow through these things. And I'm grateful for the rapport that I have with my one-on-one clients, with my private coaching clients, because when things like this come up, I move through it with them. And that establishes an even deeper trust and an even deeper relationship with the people that I'm working with, because if they don't trust me and they don't feel safe around me and I don't provide an environment of safety, they won't go as deep as they can go. They won't expand as much as they can, because if I'm a foundational person that they're supposed to be able to come to and say anything and everything to, and I'm being loosey-goosey with my boundaries, what am I teaching them?
Yeah.
So that was a huge lesson for me. It was a huge learning space, and I'm so grateful. You know who you are. If you're listening, thank you. But this is part of establishing boundaries, understanding that, and none of us are beyond stepping past boundaries or violating those boundaries.
I'm glad you brought this up, because I think that so many healers will overextend out of their agreements, because you don't have to call them contracts, folks. You can say agreements. You make an agreement with someone. You say, be there at 10, and you're there 15 minutes early. That's you. You know what I'm saying? Like, that doesn't mean that applies to everyone. If you tell me to be there at 10, I'm going to be there at 10:05. I'm just being real with you right now, because that's just the way the time usually works out for me, is like 5 to 7 minutes after. And so if someone is really stringent on time, that is problematic. If they're a client and I say we're going to start at 10 and it's 10:03, or as a guide, you're the one showing up early and saying, no, I know I said it's a 1 hour call, but it's really fine if it's 3. That might feel like you're giving more, when in actuality, it doesn't feel safe to the other person, because now they don't know what to anticipate from your behavior. And we've gone to events before where they went over by hours, and I really felt a way about it, because I planned my food and my eating and certain, dogs' medications and things around. Some things have to be scheduled for me to feel safe. And so if I'm sitting in an event that said they'd stop at 5 and it's 8 o'clock, I'm feeling away when they say it's almost done, when I know that I have dogs that need seizure medication. You know what I'm saying? So I think that sometimes we think that we're giving more, when we could actually be instilling safety by not sticking to boundaries, communicating the change, or even offering that it's a possibility.
Yep. And that's one of the things, y'all, all the coaches out there and the people who are listening to this, the people who are in the space of being the healer, being the coach and all that, stick with the program that you offer to your clients. When you overextend yourself, you teach people how to fall out of a tight container. And so it's very important when you're coaching people to stick to your guns, stick to your rules, and be mindful. If you're going to go outside of it, get consent. Radical consent is so important, especially when it comes to boundaries. Is it okay if I move outside this boundary space? And if the person says no and you don't honor it, then the consequence that comes is going to be the consequence.
And they might not even really understand it consciously. It's a surprise. It makes someone feel unsafe when things can suddenly shift, especially if they lived in environments that didn't have stability. So, all right, Ta, bring it home as far as just kind of reflecting back on boundaries, the differences between boundaries and requests, and just put a bow on kind of what we talked about today. And then I'll share a bit more about this upcoming workshop where you're really going to get into how to transform relationships.
Yeah, y'all. So a request. So boundaries and requests have everything to do with limits. I want to put a limit on something because there's a threshold that I have that I can withstand something. So I put a limit on something. Now I can make a request for you to follow the limit. Hey, please don't touch me like that, right? Or don't touch me like that. Or get away from me, right? Those are requests. If they're not backed up with something to enforce the request, the person may not honor that as a boundary, okay? And so a request is a very, very light boundary space, right? And it's like, hey, don't touch me there. Now, if a person says, what are you going to do? I can say, well, I'm going to punch you in the face, or I'm going to kick you, or I'm going to pinch you, I'm going to walk away, or you'll never speak to me again. There's a consequence.
Or I'm going to feel hurt, or I'm going to feel whatever.
A boundary is an enforced situation, an enforced limit. A request is a limit, is a declaration of a limit. Hey, listen, I have a limit on this. I have a limit. You can even say, I have a boundary. Cool. That's still a request, right? That's an announcement that you have a boundary. But if you don't establish what the consequence is, then the other person might walk through it. Now, I may ball up my fist and be like, don't touch me. That is actually me putting up a potential
signaling a boundary
that you may get punched in the face. And if you don't understand what that is, then maybe it's time to learn about physical gestures. This is why we talk about gesture boundaries and the gestures, facial expressions. If I'm talking to somebody and I see them ball up their fist, I'm from the hood. That's a boundary, right? Somebody balling up their hand is a boundary. If I get any closer, I may get slugged, and I'm not trying to get slugged, right? If somebody comes and picks up a bat and starts brandishing that, that's a boundary. They are enforcing that request for you to back up. Okay, and that's a place that you may get a consequence.
So I don't know why this came to my head, but when I process things, it comes in imagery. So it reminds me when I would go to the Parade of Homes in Utah, and they would take you through all these new construction homes to see, new architectural design. And when you went in, you had to take off your shoes or put on those like little slippers that go over your shoes to go in the houses. Had to, or else you can't come in. So the boundary was, if you want to come in, you can do this or this. Otherwise, you can't come in. So it wasn't a request. It wasn't like, hey, y'all, when you come to my house, please take off your shoes. And if someone's like, do I have to? Depending on when I washed the floors last, I might say, no, it's fine. Just leave it on. It's a request, but it's not.
It's a loose boundary. It's loose.
Yeah.
It's variable. Yeah, and that's the thing. Your boundary, the enforcement can be loosey-goosey. It can be a tight boundary, which is an absolute no, and it can be loose where it's like a maybe. And so when it comes to certain things, there's very loose and there's very tight things. When it comes to like Tantra events, yes and it's an emphatic yes. The boundary that is established, a group boundary that's established, it's either an emphatic yes or the answer is no. Maybe is no, I don't know,
sure,
possibly sure. All of that stuff means no, and we agree upon that at the beginning. And so,
where me at home, if you ask me a question and I go, sure, you're like, wait, no, yes or no? I'm like, well, maybe.
And I'm totally confused. So I don't do anything. That's my boundary with myself. And with that, come out to this event. It's going to be really wonderful.
Yeah. So I have all the details. Should I spit it now? You feel solid with what we talked about today?
Listen,
anything else you want to share before I spit out the details?
Requests are wonderful. They're really nice. And like my father used to say, it's nice to want things. What are you going to do about it? I want you to not touch me, okay? And if you touch me, I'm going to do something about it. And either it may have something to do physically with you getting away from me or me getting away from you or denial of contact. There's a limit. And so understanding what your limits are is tremendously important. Understanding what your boundaries are, what your request is, what your limits are, and being able to enact that and express it. And if you can't do it by yourself, get help.
Mm-hmm. And that really starts with understanding your own constructs and the constructs of the people you're dealing with. It's something we teach at the Condor Approach. But if you know that boundaries, whether unspoken, spoken, or requests, have not been honored, and you're really trying to develop that confidence to enforce, or, not enforce is a strong word, that you're looking to really put these into place in more of a collaborative way, and you're really ready to transform your relationships, Ta is going to be doing a workshop. It's a digital virtual workshop, but it is live on August 14th from 5 to 8 p.m. Central Time. The early bird pricing is $97. So if you book by August 5th, you're going to get it for $97. If you join after August 5th, it's going to be $147. So you are literally saving a third of the price if you book before August 5th, which is a week from today. So y'all, this is really an incredible opportunity to actually learn how to create and go through a boundary and request building process, getting a template in place that's unique to you. I mean, anyone that has done any deep dive work with Ta, who is running this workshop, knows that there is no one breaking things down and pulling it apart the way that Ta does. So either way, this interactive Done With You framework is going to give you an exact path forward in getting what you want and what you need and where you want to be in a way that feels good and in alignment for you. So I know that I'm going to be there, right? I'm sitting here shelling out my bread for some of that Ta witty time, son. Sucker. And if you want to go deeper, he's doing a retreat in October. Like, there's a lot of opportunities coming up that are, I would say, adjacent to the psychedelic space and that we touch on at the Condor approach, but this one is boundary specific.
Yeah, and if you're into in-person situations, the retreat that I have in October, it's going to be October 25th to the 27th. It's called the Sista Sanctuary. It is an invite-only situation, so if you want to be invited, hit me up and let's have a conversation.
So it is the Sista. So is this for women? Is this for non-binary? Is this for trans women? Who are we talking about here?
Female bodies. Mm-hmm. If you are non-binary and you have female plumbing, then you are invited to the space. So I'm talking about female as far as your physical sex dynamic. What your gender role is, that's on you. But this is for female bodies. I want female bodies to be able to understand what their dynamics are around a male that's kind of leading a situation that's outside of weird predatory sexual dynamics or anything like that, so that they understand how to set energetic boundaries. They understand how to set talk boundaries, all of these things around a masculine energy. So that's what it's all about. It's going to be really wonderful safe space, 3 days, Friday to Sunday. And we're going to cook together. We're going to cook dinner and breakfast together. We're going to have, it's not going to be a tremendous amount of workshopping. We're going to have a lot of dialogue, and we're going to be talking about boundaries. We're going to be talking about masculine energy, feminine energy, and boundaries.
Awesome. Well, y'all, that is our show for today. So if you loved this episode, share it with a friend, or maybe you're in a relationship that you're really trying to dial in this boundary creation, or you're struggling to a little bit, then come check it out. If you want to go deeper, we have the link in the show notes to this virtual container. Yes, there will be a replay, but it's really meant for you to be live. So, we're not going to enforce the boundary that you have to be live, but we're going to tell you that in order for this to be effective, like, let's be real, you're not going to listen to it later. Okay. Like, I see on the back end that people don't watch it later. So do yourself a favor, block the time for the date, which is August 5th or August 14th,
2024.
August 14th, 5 to 8 p.m. Get a sitter for the kids. Do what you got to do. Bring your kids if they are down for some adult dialogue, but we can't guarantee, the maturity of the conversations after, and learn how to create and put into place effectively boundaries. So until next time, be easy.
Be free.
Be whatever you won't be. Peace.
Peace.